So the county's planning commission last night, after 8 hours of deliberation, decided to recommend the approval of Stanford's general use permit. And Janati, you were there for every last minute of that meeting. I'm curious, given the complexity of this topic, what was the kind of overall mindset of the commission as it was deliberating?
Well, I feel like the commission was basically weighing two competing proposals, one from Stanford, which was trying to turn the process into a negotiation, and another one proposed by county staff, which is looking at the process as a regulator. It's sort of like, we're not going to negotiate things that you're required to provide. And in most cases, including with the approval of the general use permit, the commission basically leaned on its own staff's analysis, as one could expect, but they gave Stanford significant concessions when it comes to transportation, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little later.
So overall, I'm kind of curious, in what ways did Stanford sort of win, and in what ways did it lose? Because there has been quite a tug of war between the county and the university over requirements for approval of the general use permit, starting with the application itself, and then there was the environmental impact report that said there were certain conditions it needed to meet, and the county had conditions of approval, and on Monday, Stanford proposed its development agreement terms. So what are we looking at?
Well, Stanford won because the Planning Commission recommended approving its general use plan application, which will allow it to build 2.275 million square feet of academic space, 2,600 student beds, 40,000 square feet of childcare and transportation spaces. So that's a victory. So the win, you approve the project. The loss is they approved the project that's not exactly the project Stanford was planning to build. The commission has, in particularly, one of its most significant decisions it had to make is should it support what the county planners called Housing Alternative A, which roughly quadruples the number of workforce housing units that Stanford would be required to build. As you recall, back like 2 years ago or so, when Stanford first proposed its application, they proposed only like 550 workforce units, which was part of the overall package of the 3,150 units / student beds. And over the course of the process, the county staff really wanted to separate the actual units versus the student beds. And they pointed out that basically you can have 9,000 people on campus because of this growth, and 550 workforce units isn't going to cut it. So they explored various alternatives, and the one that they ended up with ends up with 2,172 beds of workforce housing. So much more than Stanford had proposed. And they didn't buy Stanford's argument that they're building graduate student housing as Escondido Village now, and they're building a 215 unit development in Menlo Park called Middle Plaza right now. They should get some credit for those, and the commission basically said, no, that's for stuff that's already been in the pipeline. The new permit, you need to create new housing, basically.
Yeah, Stanford wanted that in-progress housing to count towards, and significantly too.
Right.
I mean, they wanted to get credit for 365, I think.
It was
865.
Yeah, 650 units just for Escondido Village, and then, another 215 for Middle Plaza.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see the progression between the application numbers and the current numbers, so you just mentioned 550 workforce housing units. And then in Stanford's proposal on Monday, it was enumerating 575 just affordable housing units. So it's really changed from its initial application.
Yeah, I think it became clear, like when the county released its conditions of approval, that they will be requiring way more housing units than Stanford had initially proposed. And so I feel like Stanford was kind of flexible in that a little bit. In their proposal, as part of the development agreement, they basically proposed going up to as high as like 1,300 some, which, as they would say it, it's basically everything the county asked for, but getting credit for the developments we just mentioned, and which the county rejected. So that number has moved around, but I do think it's remarkable that usually when we see developers propose gigantic projects, and this has been called the largest project in the county's history, The negotiations pertain to the size of the development. There's usually some back and forth, usually gets smaller and meets somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
In this case, what the county approved is actually far more development than Stanford had proposed. And Stanford had already proposed the biggest project in county's history. So I think that made this kind of unique, but it also kind of underscored the seriousness with which county staff is looking at housing as a huge regional issue and like a current crisis and something that they absolutely have to get right with this.
Yeah. Can we touch upon whether or not the County Planning Commission wanted Stanford to build most of its housing on campus versus off campus? Because that's something that Stanford wanted to flip.
Yeah, on this one, just like with the housing units, they basically went along with the planning staff's recommendation, and that was to require 70% of the new units to be on campus, at least 70, and then up to 30% to be within 6 miles. So yeah, Stanford wanted more flexibility with that. They proposed inverting the formula 30-70, 30 inside campus, and there was a little bit of support of that from one commissioner who thought this would create more flexibility. If you build more housing outside of campus, it's potentially open to many more different kinds of workers. But ultimately, this commissioner, Bob Levy, went along with his colleagues and basically supported the county staff's recommendation to have 70% being on campus.
Yeah, Stanford itself said they thought that its workers would prefer that choice, that they don't necessarily want to be on campus.
Yeah, it cited some internal surveys, and then...
How much of it is affordable now? Because that was, I know, a concern.
I think there's about 575 units of affordable housing that would be built. Well, actually, hold on. I do need to double check on that. 575 is what Stanford had proposed building in the first quarter as part of its development agreement. I'm going to get back to you with that number later, but it would be consistent with basically the EAR, which looked at how much housing the expansion would require.
Yeah, let's talk about traffic for a second, because there's this whole nexus between how much housing is on campus, how much traffic's going to come on. And there were vastly different proposals from Stanford and the county as far as conditions of approval. Right now, Stanford's monitoring 1 hour, one peak commute hour in the morning and one in the afternoon, and maintaining those levels of traffic.
Yeah, I think, and Stanford wanted to basically maintain this standard for the next general use permit as well. They're saying it works, and they basically said if we exceed the standard, we will pay surrounding communities for various infrastructure projects to improve the traffic situation. But the county staff had proposed 3 significant changes. Number one, changing from 1 peak hour to a 3-hour peak period, recognizing the fact that the commute patterns have changed and some people leave a little earlier, a little later to avoid traffic and thereby basically expand the traffic period, the peak period. So that's one change. Another one is that we're going to start counting reverse trips.
Which was off campus, from
Stanford
off,
elsewhere, which is not being done now and which Stanford strongly opposed. And then the third thing is they're going to start counting average daily trips, which is throughout the whole day, and this includes visitors to Stanford events. And they weren't going to start enforcing that immediately. They were going to wait until Stanford kind of built some housing first, establishing a baseline, and then from that point forward, make sure that reverse commutes don't exceed 2% increase in consecutive years, and average day trips don't exceed 3%. And so basically, this is the one issue in which the Planning Commission actually went against the staff and with Stanford. They basically agreed with Stanford's arguments that if you require this much housing to be built on campus, this will necessitate reverse commutes because you have spouses and roommates, and you have kids that have to be taken to school elsewhere, ballet classes, whatever, you name it. So this was kind of one concession that Stanford did win. The Planning Commission agreed to keep mostly the current plan, but with a peak period difference.
Okay.
But not to count reverse commutes or average day trips at this time. They referred it to staff for further analysis, and I'm sure these issues will reemerge when this gets to the Board of Supervisors. So, but that was Stanford's big win from last night.
Right. So one bone of contention lately, especially, has been whether or not this process is done in private versus public. Stanford, again, on Monday, suggested that the county pursue a development agreement with them, and that it be facilitated in a private meeting so that they could come up with some agreeable terms. County leaders, especially Supervisor Joe Simidian, has been adamant about making sure that this negotiations or this whole process is done in public. So I'm kind of struck by one thing, which is that Simidian is somewhat vindicated because there have been compromises, as we just saw last night. I mean, it's iterative.
Right. Yeah, it's changing.
It's changing. But the process that Stanford wanted to pursue was with a development agreement. And is that completely off the table now?
It's not. The development agreement that Stanford had just proposed, that one's off the table. The one that they introduced Monday, they actually applied for a development agreement back last fall, but they had a more concrete kind of proposal that they released Monday that we reported on. So they formally rejected that one, but the county's position has always been, we have the authority to negotiate a development agreement. That the Board of Supervisors gave it to us last year, but we're not going to use that authority until the time is right, and the time is not right now. So they basically said, when it's to the advantage of the county, that's when we're going to do it. And one last thing, I'm going to loop back to Linda's question, 933 units of affordable housing as part of the requirement. And also about 100 additional ones for the inclusionary zoning requirement for the market rate housing. It's a little confusing, but it's going to be ultimately about 1,000 would be BMR. But going back to development agreement thing, it's not completely off the table. This offer is, but at some point in the future. And Supervisor Simidian and Supervisor Chavez, who've been authorized by the board to deal with the development agreement, they basically said that to resume this, it has to be completely open and transparent. And you have to have this commitment to the Palo Alto School District, $138 million roughly over 40 years that it had offered previously, but without any kind of strings attached.
Right,
Yeah, without depending on development agreement being approved by the county.
So it's kind of interesting to look at the strategy of how do you use a development agreement. I think Stanford wanted to negotiate sort of everything, every last detail, and then kind of come out with the agreement with the county and say, okay, this is what we've agreed on, and people can look at it. It wasn't ever clear to me whether or not they thought that the public could then weigh in and affect change to that. But now it seems like with the closure of the development agreement process that was started last fall, with a 6-1 vote by the Planning Commission. Really what the county's looking at is we'll go through the regulatory process in large part, and then maybe there's going to be some other things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. I think they want to establish the baseline, basically say these things aren't negotiable. You have to do it because if you don't do it, we can't make the findings to allow approval. That it won't harm health, safety, general well-being of the county. They have to make these findings, and if you approve a gigantic development that makes the traffic a lot worse and has all these impacts, they just can't approve it. So they're basically saying this is a requirement. You have to do this. Now that we've established this, what would you like to negotiate on? Whereas Stanford's approach was let's negotiate on everything. Let's consider these conditions and development agreement, and the whole menu of options. And you could see why the county would resist it, because the county has like almost a police power. If a police officer pulls me over, I would like to be able to say, don't give me the ticket, let's negotiate other kinds of things. But that's probably not going to get me very far.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of akin to what's happening here.
Yeah.
But now that it's established, it could still move ahead.
Yeah. One quote that was in your story, I was really struck by it because it was the difference in characterization of $4.7 billion as benefits versus requirements. So Sylvia Gallegos, who's the Deputy Executive Director?
Deputy County Executive.
County Executive. Said that really, if you look at it, a lot of the things that Stanford's offering are part of the development application itself, 2,600 beds. You can't say that you're going to provide 2,600 student beds and then say, oh, hey, look, that's worth $1.4 billion.
Yeah.
And then say that that's part
Yeah,
of
the issue is framed very differently. I think Stanford kind of characterizes it as investment in housing when it showed its list. but when they discuss it, or just generally, it's kind of seen as a package of benefits. I think they technically call it investment, which would be accurate. But
Okay.
but when you negotiate a development agreement, you're basically saying, here's what we're offering to the community. The county, basically responded, you're not offering this to the community. You're doing this because you have to do it to mitigate your impacts. And that's, if you don't do it, you won't be allowed to proceed. And the student beds was the most obvious example. I don't think anybody except Stanford students will benefit from the student beds. But they also looked at like the $1.1 billion that Stanford is investing in its own internal transportation demand management. I mean, you need that to meet your no net commute trips requirement, which is regulatorily mandated. So it's not a bonus, it's kind of what you have to do if you want to keep developing. So so the difference was pretty stark. Like Stanford said 4.7 billion, and the county said, once you strip away everything that Stanford actually has to do, it's like 166 million.
166 million versus 4.7 billion.
It's just a different scale. It's a different magnitude.
It doesn't seem like we're talking about the same things.
Yeah, so it's negotiation. Things get framed a little differently.
Exactly. So the other area of sort of characterization contention was just on the development agreement as a process. So the county says this is highly unusual.
They've never done it before.
They've never done it before. Whereas Stanford's saying, hey, this is how it goes. They've
done it a bunch of times.
Yeah, with the city of Palo Alto over the hospital, Redwood City as well. So that's kind of been an interesting thing where we have the same words and like completely different interpretations, and a reluctance to meet in the middle.
Well, it kind of makes sense because, I mean, Stanford University, as commissioners pointed out at every meeting, is like a world-leading institution in many ways and creates all sorts of benefits for Silicon Valley and the immediate region. But the Stanford University they were considering at the meeting is the developer. And just like any other developer, they would rather get into the room and say, what could we work out that benefits everybody, as opposed to have an entity they can't control impose conditions. So when you look at Stanford, wearing its developer's hat, it's easy to see why they would rather have the ability to negotiate everything as opposed to just have things imposed on them.
Yeah. Now that Stanford has the backing of the Planning Commission, some people have talked about, well, if the conditions are just too infeasible for Stanford, it could always pull its application. Any indication that could be on the horizon?
I haven't seen
anything you've heard from Stanford.
I haven't seen any indications. Just informally, I asked some people after the meeting, "What do you think?" And they took some good takeaways from that, like the fact that commissioners still said they would like to see a development agreement in the future, which several of them did at numerous meetings, and they did get a victory in traffic. It did not seem like they're going to pull their application. It's possible, but if they do, then they just mitigated all the impacts of future growth. So I don't think the county is going to shed too many tears. Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
It's hard to see that happening because they do have like very legit and real academic goals. They have all these emerging disciplines, and I can't imagine Stanford just saying we're going to stop growing.
So people are still weighing in on the whole process. The city of Palo Alto, I understand, just submitted a letter yesterday.
Yeah, procrastinating. No, I mean, this is going to go to the Board of Supervisors eventually, so there's still time to consider Palo Alto's comments. But yeah, they submitted a letter like right before the Planning Commission meeting. Basically, like other cities, Palo Alto wants to see full mitigation, the big buzzword in the whole process. Basically, Stanford has to take care of all its impacts. And one of the key takeaways from the letter is that the transportation funding and investment that Stanford is proposing falls well short of what's needed if Stanford is to meet its fair share obligations to Palo Alto. And its consultant calculated the various costs of things that need improvements. And it came out to about $260 million that Palo Alto thinks Stanford should be asked to provide.
Isn't Stanford offering $15 million?
They're offering $15 million for some bike improvements and pedestrians, that kind of things. Palo Alto's looking for much bigger things, like 500. There's a $500 million project that it's envisioning, which is the kind of renovation of the transit center at the downtown Caltrain station. Right. And they want Stanford to pay 19.5%, which they determined as the fair share based on usership.
Oh, interesting.
So this amounts to $98 million alone. So that project alone dwarfs what Stanford has proposed. There's the Charleston Meadow grade crossing, which
Grade separations.
the
in
grade
general.
separation, which is like $600 million project. They want Stanford to contribute $155 million. Again, that 19.5% ratio.
There's a lot of Stanford people using Caltrain.
Yeah.
That's a huge.
Yeah, and they depend on
Backbone
Caltrain
to
as
the
a big TDM measure for its existing GUP and presumably for future ones. There's also like, transit support, millions of dollars, the retrofit of the Cal Avenue train station, which would be about $3.9 million out of a $20 million price tag, that kind of stuff. So Palo Alto, as well as other cities, we saw two Menlo Park council members, Betsy Nash and Cecilia Taylor last night. At East Palo Alto's Larry Moody, they came to the meeting, and basically everybody kind of had a similar sentiment. They need to take care of their impacts, fully mitigate them, deal with the cities. And Palo Alto and East Palo Alto both expressed the fact that Stanford needs to do a better job communicating with the cities. Like Larry Moody said that, we're just 2.5 miles away from you and we're going to be inundated with students and faculty, which is going to kind of make traffic and gentrification worse. And Palo Alto, in its new letter of demands from Ed Shikata, the city manager, basically requested a change in which Stanford would be formally required to work with cities on transportation. So that's another kind of.
Yeah. Has
major
Stanford
demand.
met with East Palo Alto at all? It sounded like from Larry Moody that there was no communication.
He wasn't that specific. I'm not exactly sure. I know that like a coalition of cities from San Mateo County have kind of banded to negotiate with Stanford. And so there was some back and forth between that coalition and Stanford. Okay. And Stanford kind of made a point of the fact that its development agreement offer does include $15 million for Santa Clara County City, for San Mateo County cities. So it integrated some of the concerns from those cities into its proposal, but I'm not sure how much individual back and forth it's had with each of the cities.
Sure, yeah. Any other issues or questions at this point?
There's lots of other issues. Open space protection, 99 years, they agreed with that. They supported bird-safe design for new buildings, which is something
bird-safe design?
Yeah. Okay. They supported kind of protecting oak trees, possibly considering designating them as heritage trees. There were a few things relating to the community plan, which they also approved, which we could spend a lot of time discussing, but they're not as big as the other two issues in the grand scheme of things.
The community plan comes out of the general use permit, doesn't it?
It's an additional document to the general use permit. The community plan is part of the county's general plan. It's sort of like a specific plan, but pertaining to Stanford, to Stanford land. And so that's the document that includes the existing requirement that if Stanford wants to build in the foothills, it needs 4/5 approval. And that expires in 2025. And the newly amended community plan extends that by 99 years, as county staff had recommended. So that's
there's a lot more.
But we have a few more months to cover this before it gets to the board, so I'm sure more things will emerge.
It was a marathon meeting yesterday, but that concludes the Planning Commission's current involvement.
Yeah, and they approved the environmental impact report, so it was a series of actions that basically moved the subject forward to the Board of Supervisors, where it shall be continued.
They're not meeting this summer on it, are they?
I don't believe so. I haven't seen the schedule for Board of Supervisors, but we'll be reporting on it well before it happens. So.
Okay, and if there were to be a development agreement negotiation, that I believe would come back before the Planning Commission?
It would, yeah. Staff said it multiple times.
Okay,
yeah.
So Planning Commission might not be all the way done with this?
No, depending on development agreement. That's correct.
Well, thanks for unpacking that for us. Long meeting, and I appreciate your reporting.
My pleasure.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. Thanks for watching. If you think of anyone else who would be interested in this topic, you can share the link with them so they can see the video too. Just hit the share button below for sharing the link on social media or on email. We'll be taking a break next week for July 4th. Have a happy holiday, and we'll see you in July.